Thymesia kind of came out of the blue. I never even heard of it until a week after it came out when streamers started playing it. Upon looking at the Steam page, I was a bit skeptical since, to date, Nioh is really the only non-FromSoft Souls game to be exceptional and stand out on its own in my opinion. There are others that are decent and even good, but it always comes across as discount Dark Souls. Though there is a bit of a discount feel to Thymesia, it compensates for this by having a phenomenal combat system and a pretty interesting story. This is the studio's first game, so obviously they're going to have limitations. But many of the issues they do have are less about budget and more to do with direction and skill. Why don't we start off with what the game gets right: the combat. The combat of Thymesia is its greatest strength. Enemies have 2 health bars. You deal damage to the white one to inflict wounds, and the green bar underneath is where you deal permanent damage, rending their wounds. If you wait too long, their wounds will heal and you'll have to inflict new wounds to rend. You would initially think this would encourage aggressive play, but you could easily just throw a feather dart to prevent regeneration. You fight in a similar way to Sekiro with its deflection mechanic, only there are dramatically more options. There is the basic sword attack and deflection, which does more damage to the white health bar. Then you have plague weapons, which cost energy, and claw attacks, both of which damage the green health bar more. You can also charge up the claw to steal an enemy's plague weapon and use it without expending energy. Unlike Sekiro, the dodge isn't just window dressing, it's actually useful in combat. And on top of all of that, you have regenerating feather darts that you can use to interrupt critical attacks that can't be deflected without a particular talent. On its face, this may seem a little busy, and early on I did feel this game ran the risk of mechanical overload. However, they compensate for this by giving you many options to customize what elements of the combat you want to focus on. There are talent categories for each of these mechanics, except for plague weapons, which have their own upgrade system. If you don't like using feather darts, you can buy talents to either enable you to deflect critical attacks normally, or you can dodge into it to jump above them and do a plunging strike from the air. If you don't like the deflection mechanic, you can invest points into enhancing your dodge. This flexibility allows you to home in on a playstyle that you're comfortable with. You can change your talents at a chair at any time, so you can experiment. I almost never used the claw or feather darts in my playthrough. I used the claw to reave enemies' plague weapons from them, but never to actually attack in battle. They both worked well when using them, I just preferred other solutions to the problems they address. I went with a pretty straightforward playstyle, relying on attacks, deflects, dodges, and surprisingly plague weapons to deal significant damage. I did not expect I would use or like the plague weapons as much as I did. They do a lot more permanent damage than the saber, so they kind of force you to use it if you don't use the claw. And I'm glad the game forces you to go beyond just the base mechanics, because if the saber was more effective, I probably wouldn't have used the plague weapons much and the game would have been less interesting. Beyond them just looking and feeling cool to use, they spice up the gameplay with unique effects. I mostly used heavy weapons like the great sword and hammer that stuns enemies for a few seconds, allowing me to follow up with the saber for even more damage. I did experiment with some others, like the bow that deals a lot of damage at range for a small amount of energy. The halberd does several fast strikes for high damage, and near the end of the game I used the javelin sword a lot, which has you dodge back while throwing a spear at the enemy. The spear stays in for a few seconds before exploding, allowing you to combo the saber with the timed explosion. There are also some that aren't weapons at all. One simply spends some of your health to buff your saber attack damage. Another has you grow tentacles out of your back to lash the enemy with. Overall, I found that most of them are useful depending on your playstyle, and they all change how you play. Aside from stealing them from enemies, you can unlock plague weapons in your permanent slot by acquiring skill shards for that weapon. Once unlocked, you can use these shards to upgrade the weapon to increase its damage, lower the energy cost, or reduce the cooldown time before you can use it again. Midway through the upgrade process, you unlock a second version of the attack. You can also enhance plague weapons by fulfilling certain attribute requirements, like absorbing half the damage taken while casting if you have 10 vitality, or inflicting bleed on the target if you have 20 plague. This means that certain plague weapons are better suited for different builds. There are only 3 stats, but some weapons mix 2 attributes, as once you max out the upgrades for a weapon, a new attribute requirement will appear. So you might have that 10 vitality requirement on the weapon initially, but when you fully upgrade it, you can make it break the enemy's super armor as well for 20 strength. This gives you a lot more consideration when leveling up your attributes than just more saber damage, more health, or more claw damage and energy. Oh, but the flexibility doesn't stop there. They go the extra mile and let you customize your healing potions. There are 3 potion types to choose from. One slowly regenerates a lot of health, one heals for a moderate amount but heals immediately, and the other is a quick heal with more potions but with low health restoration. I never really used the slow one outside of experimentation, as it heals for way more than I need and doesn't fit with my fast-paced playstyle. Once I unlocked the quick heals with 2 extra doses, there was no going back to the moderate heals either. They heal for half my health once fully upgraded, and I don't like being that much under half health anyways. You are also given control over how you upgrade the potions. You get alchemy enhancers for mini-bosses that you can use to either add another potion dose, increase its healing capability, or add an ingredient slot to apply special effects to the potion. This third option of potion crafting is actually pretty similar to my proposal in my Elden Ring review as to what the Flask of Wonders physic should have been. Fully upgraded, you can mix 3 ingredients with a potion, each with their own effect. There are also certain combinations of ingredient types that result in an extra effect, like increasing your damage by 10% if you combine black pepper, garlic, and basil. You find hints to these recipes as documents scattered throughout the world, and you get the ingredients themselves as rare drops from killing enemies or finding them in the levels you go through. This fits well with the theme of being a plague doctor / alchemist, and actually solves a problem that a lot of these Souls-like games have had, including ones from FromSoft. These alchemy effects are similar to single-use items you find in games like Dark Souls. The problem with them in those games is that they are single-use, and thus feel more like something you use if you're having a hard time with a certain boss or enemy. This basically makes it just another form of spirit summons, an easy mode or training wheels to help new players. This means you never really interact with them, and a large portion of the loot in the world is meaningless. Thymesia fixes this by having these effects as a permanent part of your build. It also helps that it's integrated into your healing, which everyone uses, meaning you don't have to go out of your way to use a third wheel mechanic. Thymesia manages to create a combat system that allows for build variety and thus replayability despite only having 1 weapon and 3 attributes. They do this not through stats and numbers, but primarily through skills, passive effects, tools, and healing customization. They essentially succeed where Sekiro failed, having skills and tools be useful in combat, while defining your character with a particular build and playstyle. This also shows that forcing the use of certain mechanics can lead to greater choice for the player, whether it be forcing them to either use the claw or the plague weapons, the feather dart's dodge counter or critical deflects, or the ingredients for potions. The game adds another layer to the base combat and gets you customizing your character more. The game also recognizes that not every mechanic needs to be used by everyone. This allows them to create more mechanics than will likely be used by the players on any given playthrough. This further increases player choice and adds to the distinctiveness of their playstyle. Overall, this is one of the best combat systems I have seen in an action game to date, and this is only the developer's first project. Being the developer's first project, it's not surprising that the rest of the game could use some work. Let's start with the enemy design. The enemies are almost entirely humanoid, and you see about 80% of them by the end of the first level. Granted, there are only 3 levels with multiple missions, but still, 2/3 of the game offer very few surprises in this regard. It's so bad that there are no new enemy types in the final stage at all. I get the limited resources of such a small team, but there are solutions that aren't that costly. A simple solution is to spread them out across the stages a little more and not blow your load all on the first level. Have some of the less mutated knights only show up in the castle to make it more distinct. Even though this doesn't actually increase the enemy variety, it makes it much less noticeable. You also have unique animations and skeletons from non-humanoid bosses that you can use to make enemies like smaller worms, bats, and tentacle creatures. I think they were hesitant to add too many different types of enemies because you can weave unique plague weapons from every enemy type and boss in the game, meaning one new enemy type means having to create a whole nother plague weapon, 2 attacks for it, and having to balance it with the rest of the game. This ties their hands behind their back in a way that isn't a problem for other games. I think a solution to this is to have one generic plague weapon that you weave from enemies that don't wield a weapon. This would allow you to create more non-humanoid enemy types without having to figure out a unique weapon for each of them. Now, the quality of the enemies we do have is fairly good. Most of them have weapons with clear attack patterns. The base mob enemies aren't much of a threat on their own, but can turn the tide against you when fighting multiple enemies at once. Given that deflection is such a vital element to the gameplay, fighting groups of enemies head-on is a bad idea. Trying to deflect multiple attackers at once won't end well. This means that maneuvering the battlefield with dodges and killing weaker enemies fast is your best bet in these scenarios. There are also slightly tougher mob enemies with more health, but they become pretty trivial later on as well. The mini-boss enemies are the real challenge. Beyond the higher health, they are usually a lot faster with more varied attacks. They use critical attacks more often and sometimes combo into them, so you have to react pretty fast. The slower ones that use heavier weapons have trickier deflect timings due to large windups, and if they hit, they take out a lot of your health at once. Generally speaking, they did a good job at balancing the difficulty of the enemies with each other and against the player, and there is a nice mix of combat paces and patterns to deal with despite the lack of enemy variety. The bosses on Thymesia are mostly pretty great. However, there are 2 gimmick bosses, one of which isn't terrible, and the other one, is. The first of these, the terrible one, isn't really a boss at all. It's just a giant tree thing making noise in the background while you progress through a level of normal enemies. At the end of the level, you press the kill button to execute the boss that you've been listening to the whole time. Look, there are ways to do gimmick fights, but this boss doesn't threaten you at all. You just run past him after he attacks. It's not even close. You also deal no damage to him at any point in the level. You're not even required to destroy the poison sacs on the stage. I would say that at the very least you should have to destroy them and have them deal damage to the boss. So by the end of the level you actually are just finishing him off. If you don't destroy all of the sacs and press the kill button at the end, the boss grabs you and tears you in half, as he's not damaged enough to deal a final blow. Beyond that, make him actually threaten you while you go from point to point. Here you would need to time your movement between fist smashes, punches, poison sprays, etc. This would make it a little better, but there's very little you can do to salvage this fight. The other gimmick boss isn't as bad, as the giant worm actually threatens you. It's mostly just a puzzle to figure out what to do at the right time, but it is more dynamic. It's fine for the spectacle they're going for, whereas the spectacle of the first gimmick boss is heavily undermined by it not posing a threat. I know a lot of people don't like the term ludonarrative dissonance, mostly because it's overused, but this is certainly an instance in which the term is applicable. The rest of the bosses, as I said, work very well. There are 6 of these more traditional bosses. It's a mix of fast-paced and heavy fights, with most of them having 2 phases. The second phase of the bosses were largely just a repeat of the first phase with a few extra moves. They really weren't that different. Aside from having to grind through 2 health bars of nearly the same fight patterns, the fight itself is the best showcase of the game's combat system. They are very difficult at first until you figure out the patterns of when to deflect and when to go on the offense. You also have to be patient enough to not go for more damage than you have a window for. Relying on the enemy's attack patterns like this actually makes the combat very defensive in practice, though this may be due to my reliance on deflects as opposed to dodging around and attacking during windows, so this may just be due to my playstyle I went with. I would not say that these are exceptional bosses, as they feel too homogeneous throughout the whole fight, but they work well for their role and they are some of the game's best content. My favorite ones were Varg, this giant knight, and Erd, the highly skilled heir to the throne. These were the slowest and fastest paced bosses respectively and were probably the hardest in the game. Erd had the most varied and interesting attacks in my opinion, with AoE effects thrown onto the stage. Overall, the traditional bosses in Thymesia are a little less difficult and varied than in some other games in the genre, but the phenomenal combat helped to make them stand out as the highlight of my experience. The level design in Thymesia is by no means bad, but it is somewhat inconsistent in terms of quality depending on the stage. As I said earlier, the game only has 3 levels, but there are separate side quests that open up new paths that you couldn't access in the main mission. You also start each of these quests in a different location with a mix-up of enemies and items. This extends the usefulness of these levels, making them feel fresh with new places to explore. This was probably the best solution for a studio with high ambition but with little resources. It's more like 3 environments with multiple levels of content going through them. This resourcefulness seems to be the only thing that allowed them to make this game at all, as building new environments is costly in development. Now, the actual design of the levels as you go through them is a bit of a mixed bag. They are mostly linear hallways with some side areas and a few shortcuts leading back to a chair. Some of these hallways are wider than others, but they are still very straightforward. There are 2 highly interconnected areas, the second half of the first level and most of the third level. Now you might say, well, isn't that half the game? But the problem is that it feels incredibly artificial in the third level. The maze-like nature of the castle is undermined by the fact that there's not much of a point to it. There was one winding path that didn't even have any enemies or items in it. Others did have enemies, but it was just there for the sake of being there. It's fine to have dead ends here and there, but the castle just felt incredibly empty. This is probably because you already have your preferred potion upgrades maxed out, so the mini-bosses don't really give you that much. They're also not as much of a threat since you're leveled up with maxed out plague weapons and potions. It doesn't help that there aren't any new enemies on this map, and the loot you get is just more ingredients and memory shards. Level design is as much about the content in the level as it is about how the level is shaped. The shaping isn't the problem in the castle, the content and bland environment are. When the final level in your game is the easiest and most boring, you're clearly missing the mark. The solutions to this is to have exclusive enemy types to this level, make them harder than in previous levels, and have unique ingredients with effects that you haven't seen up until this point. New potion effects, new plague weapons, new enemies, and higher difficulty can go a long way to salvaging an underwhelming stage. The problem with the second level is ironically the opposite. Good content with poor shaping. Despite it having many side paths, the level is almost entirely made up of linear hallways. There isn't much to suggest here, as it would be pedantic to go over how to visualize a 3-dimensional puzzle and create it. Plus, they clearly can shape levels in a non-linear manner. I will say they shouldn't try to add interconnectedness just to have it. It's okay to have some linear pathways, but if that's all there is, it gets a little stale. Similarly, if the level is nothing but an interconnected maze when that doesn't fit the theme of the stage, it can come across as artificial and inauthentic. The first level strikes this balance pretty well. It starts off linear with some side paths and shortcuts, but then opens up to have more pathways to choose from and places to explore. It also has a good amount of quality content with several unique mini-bosses, making this my favorite level in the game. Overall, I would say this game has one good level, one decent level, and one kind of boring level. Unfortunately, that means the levels get worse as the game progresses. The story of Thymesia is very underrated in my opinion. The game starts out by saying, "There's a plague that's killing people and turning creatures into monsters. The Hermes kingdom became powerful due to its alchemical cures for the disease." Okay, now play the game. They don't give you a lot of information initially, and after the cold opening, it becomes clear why. You lost your memory somehow, and you need to explore them again to figure out Hermes' answer to hopefully end the plague. Most reviewers complain about it being told largely through text documents, but I actually think it fits very well with the theme of trying to piece together clues and memories to find the right formula to cure the plague. It makes you feel like a detective who is going behind enemy lines to figure out what happened, who's responsible, and what the best solution is to fix it. Of course, in this case, going behind enemy lines involves killing them all and destroying the source of the problems in the area. I really enjoyed piecing together documents and slowly reconstructing events in my mind. Before revealing the whole picture, I got to speculate on what the rest of it would look like. This leads you down many more stories than is revealed in the end, and the one that is ultimately presented is pretty interesting. They did a great job with this, and I think detective games could learn a thing or two from Thymesia here. I do understand the criticism that the characters you meet in the game are fairly underwhelming. I think a few more lines of dialogue introducing the characters you meet would have gone a long way in giving them more of an identity. Right now they kind of just feel like lore dump machines, but I do think this is less about the dialogue and more about the fact that there is no voice acting for them. Of course, not all games need to be voice acted, and some games really just shouldn't be, but with characters so cryptic, adding a voice to them would make it feel like you're actually talking to someone and not just reading another document. There's also the fact that they have bosses talking to you during the fight, and that just doesn't work in text. I'm too busy trying to not die to read what they're saying while I'm deflecting 8 of their attacks in a row. Now I understand that the studio has limited resources and didn't want to spend it on expensive voice actors, but as far as I'm aware, all of the people working on this game do in fact have mouths, and those mouths can be used to speak words. I really think people overestimate how difficult it is to voice act. It doesn't need to be an Oscar-winning performance or anything. As long as it doesn't detract from the game, it adds to it. We seriously need to get past this idea that these celebrities have any distinct value beyond marketing. They are utterly replaceable, and it's time we start trying out their jobs ourselves. Thymesia presents an interesting conundrum. Producing more cures for the plague relies on the further spread of it. This is because the cure comes from taking an infected's blood and separating the disease from it using alchemy. This produces pure blood, the cure, and vile blood, the disease. Pure blood also enhances one's physical capabilities, so the kingdom pumped their best soldiers with a large amount of it. On top of this, they need some way of disposing the vile blood since it's highly infectious and can't be destroyed on its own. They found that certain small creatures could withstand an unusually high amount of vile blood without mutating. They decided to inject the blood into these small creatures and put them into containers. The knights then dispose of them somehow, likely by burning them to ash. It was also found that the sacred trees the kingdom is built on can absorb and decompose the plague, so researchers took samples of it to study. The rest of the picture isn't very clear. From what I gather, it seems that various characters experimented with these parts to achieve their particular goals. The Emerald wants to find a way to destroy alchemy, as it's implied that an alchemical accident caused the plague. The knights want to continue to harvest pure blood to enhance their fighting capability. Odor wants to evolve humanity through the use of vile blood, which mutates them into monsters. He also seems to want to fuse vile blood with a construct made out of the sacred trees to bring the spirit of the trees to life. This supposedly would protect people from the plague. And Asemi just wants to cure the plague because her sister is responsible for the disaster somehow. I think the story is kept intentionally vague to allow for a variety of interpretations. Regardless, I think the allegories are quite clear. There are those who want to use technological advances to increase their own strength and power. Others want to use it to solve the world's problems. There are fringe groups on the side that form a cult around it and seek to pervert its purpose. And some believe it brings more harm than good and want to go back to the way things were beforehand. While Asemi wants to use alchemy to save the world, the game is clearly steering you in the direction of the Emerald, who sees alchemy as the problem. In fact, the canon ending has you destroy alchemy, erasing all pure and vile blood from the world, but the plague and monsters remain. Whereas in Asemi's ending, you cure the plague, all of the monsters die, and the various kingdoms struggle against each other to gain control of alchemy. So they essentially go with the motifs of man shouldn't mess with things beyond his comprehension, and humans are the real monsters. These are representative of dark romanticism with the theme of the folly of man. I have major problems with this philosophy, but this review isn't about whether I agree with it or not, it's about the quality of its execution. I actually think they did a very good job with the first of these ideas. Every disaster in this game is the result of an experiment gone wrong, or someone perverting alchemy to create abominations. One of the bad endings plays into this as well. You need to combine 2 ingredients to activate Hermes' answer, and 43 out of the 47 possible combinations leads to a bad ending with chaotic, unpredictable outcomes. They do spell out for you that you screwed up, and if you paid more attention to the lore, you probably wouldn't have totally fucked the planet. There's also one very niche ending that's just a dud, and Asemi leaves you to find a cure on her own. These endings play well into the idea that only very specific formulas will work, and that we should be extremely cautious when making decisions about highly consequential technologies. I just disagree with the conservative and absolutist idea that we shouldn't try to play God because what if bad things happen? Well, that's why you need to be cautious. But not moving forward at all will just lead us to stagnate into oblivion. Regardless, they did a great job of portraying the dangers of unchecked progression. The second part of their messaging doesn't work as well. You could say that humans are the source of all of the problems in the story, but that's more of a case of incompetence than malice. And even with the cult, they turn into monsters, so it doesn't really work there either. The one thing you could latch onto is that the knights were hoarding pure blood to enhance their physical capabilities. But in the context of the story, they're going to war with monsters, not with other humans. There is a vague reference to a possible power struggle around the king's birthday when the disaster struck, but it's not at all clear what actually happened. Ultimately, the choice is between ending the plague and destroying all of the monsters, or keeping all of that while destroying the possible solution, because it's what caused the problem in the first place. The problem is, Asemi's ending shows that alchemy is a tool that can be used for good, bad, or misused by incompetence. Destroying the tool won't change the fact that humans will always be humans. If they don't war over technology, they'll war over territory. It's also not explicitly said that there was war, but rather just a struggle to control alchemy, which could also mean a struggle to comprehend it. Competition for technology isn't a bad thing, and after such a catastrophe, I'm pretty sure people will learn to be a little more cautious with it. Aside from my disagreement on the matter, they just didn't make the case very well. Luckily, this was a very small portion of their messaging. It was just a little jarring to see the game trying to shun me for the obviously correct decision, in my opinion. The aesthetics of Thymesia aren't that bad, but they could be better. The concepts and music are great, but the visuals are fairly generic. The first level is your poison swamp area that's been done a lot better in many other games. This is unfortunate because they had a circus in the area that could have added a unique feel to the level, but its only noticeable presence was 2 tents before the boss that don't really fit with the environment around them. The second level was a little better as it had this really cool library filled with blood. This was by far the most unique visual element in the game. However, this was a small zone near the end of the level, and the rest of the area felt like a plasticky, generic video game environment. Giant red crystals are kind of a video game cliché, but it can be done right if you have a good artist. The last level was, again, the worst. I think it was the most generic castle I have ever gone through in a game before. There's practically no decoration to the environment beyond a few boxes and barrels. The grave and residential areas weren't as bad, but again, many other games do similar levels better. I'll also note this game has a bit of the color coding syndrome, where you have the brown, red, and green areas. You'll obviously have distinct signifiers of particular levels, but it shouldn't just boil down to a certain color. A lava area would have the bright yellow, orange, or red contrasted with the black or brown of the rock around it. Essentially, you want your environments to have a full identity, so that the player refers to it as the Tree City area rather than the brown area. In contrast, the non-visual elements of the game's aesthetic are pretty great. The music sounds how the game looks. It adds to the ambience both in and out of combat, and the main theme is fantastic and very identifiable. They go for a dark medieval tone to the music with its abundant use of low to mid-pitched violin. Speaking of, I hear a lot of people comparing this to Bloodborne of all things. I see reviewers talking about how this game is Lovecraftian. I find this utterly baffling. Do these people just see dark fantasy and barf out terms like goth and Lovecraft as if they're interchangeable words that don't mean anything? There's precisely zero Lovecraftian elements to this game. There is no cosmic horror, there are no eldritch gods or great ones, there aren't even Lovecraftian visuals aside from one tentacle weapon. Thymesia is a classic example of low goth, with a dark romanticist twist. The framing device of Corvus telling his story to a semi is thematic of the past and present interacting with each other. A small but very important element they added was how you load into Philosopher's Hill, the game's hub area. Corvus is in some idle animation like leaning against a wall or sitting on a stone bench next to a semi. The camera is fixed in a distinct way that makes it feel like Corvus was telling a semi what he remembers. This adds to the character of Philosopher's Hill as a place to reflect upon the past to determine what to do in the future. Small details like this are often overlooked by developers, but this one element simultaneously defined the game's hub, illustrated the relationship between Corvus and a semi, and emphasized the idea that the gameplay is about Corvus trying to remember his past. This attention to detail is something that more devs should pay attention to, and this is a masterful example of its success. Thymesia is trying to punch way above its weight, with inspiration coming from Sekiro and Dark Souls. Putting aside its short length of about 15 hours and being half the price of a full game, I think it came very close to actually competing with these giants. Unfortunately, certain aspects of the game don't live up to its overall potential. The combat is fantastic, but the content you fight through is more of a mixed bag. Its story and messaging left an impression on me, but the aesthetics are mostly not up to par. So is this game better than Sekiro? Simply put, no. Thymesia solves a lot of problems that Sekiro had with its combat, mainly with skills and tools, and I would argue that this game has a more interesting story overall. However, when it comes to playable content like bosses, mini-bosses, enemies, and levels, there's no competition. Sekiro's characters are also more memorable, as they have more to say, and the great voice direction really brought them to life. So while the combat and story of Thymesia are better on paper, the lower content quality and lack of production value hurt the game's potential. With all of that said, Sekiro is a pretty high bar. and the fact that they even came close to it on their first game with a fraction of the budget is a tremendous achievement. Overall, I would give Thymesia an 8 out of 10. I know I've been a little harsh on certain aspects of the game, but I see so much potential in it that the flaws just stand out that much more. Luckily, the positives heavily outweigh the negatives. Ultimately, Thymesia is a great game that I had a lot of fun with. I highly recommend it to fans of the genre, and I hope this game is a success, because these devs clearly have some exceptional talent. Let's just hope they learn some lessons for their next one. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a nice day.